Om Namah Shivaya. Welcome to the Yogas of Sensuality and Mystery, Roots of Bhakti, Hatha, and Tantra Masterclass Part 1. I have been slaving away all day long, and actually for the past week, but especially today, to put this masterclass together. And I'm super excited about it and a little nervous. I'm a yoga scholar, and sometimes I don't always feel comfortable saying that, but I am a yoga scholar. And I'm used to revising my work again and again and again before it goes into the public eye, and I'm aware that when I speak, I don't have the opportunity to do that. So presenting something live that is recorded always makes me a little nervous. So just going to share that with you to hope to get it out of the way, and to get out of the way some of the mumbling that I've done in the past for the free e-course and other courses I've recorded. I want to avoid that this time, so I'm just putting that out there as a kind of confessional action to make this e-course clip along with a little bit of sharper speech and a little more energy, and no slowing down of my voice or unclear vocalization. So here we go. Let's get right into it. A brief bow to my teachers who come in all shapes and sizes and eras, both living and dead. My work builds on the shoulders of giants, and I'm very grateful for the many, many teachers who you see here in this image, who I won't bother to name, but who I honor in offering you the wisdom that I know of today. So I'm going to review a little bit from the e-course that was free before. So those of you who saw it, and there were a great number of you, please just bear with me, and I think a reiteration of this information may be fine to listen to, because it does have a little bit of depth, and I believe it definitely has value. So this e-course is focused on Tantra, Bhakti, and Hatha, and their kind of shared emergence, mainly the emergence historically of Bhakti and Hatha from Hatha Yoga, the yoga of the body, Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of the heart, of singing, of kirtan, from Tantra. And it emerges from a set of insights that have came to me in the study of this material, and imagining that it would be of value to modern yogis in understanding how they do the practice. So I have this image here of the heart, beautiful little image of a plant leaf looking like a heart. And I'm putting this on the screen to discuss this issue of heart yoga, this way in which we connect to the divine, to the ultimate, to transcendence, to one another, to open up space through the anahata, the heart center. Another term that we use for it is the ka, as in the term sukha. Anybody who's attended my lectures has heard my discussion of the Yoga Sutras lines on asana, yoga stira sukh asanam, the idea that asana creates sukha in the heart, sukha, good space in the heart. So this is a key nostrum, a key idea that we find in classical yoga from Patanjali's yoga of the late 4th century, Common Era, but it is a primary issue, of course, in a primary matter for Bhakti Yoga, which is exclusively a yoga of the heart. It involves techniques, of course, of singing and chanting, and as we walk through the master class, not so much in this first hour, but in the second hour, this is a two-part series, we will understand also something about its philosophy and the key teachers of it, mainly in the Middle Ages of India, but also rooted back to the time of Patanjali. Moving here forward, the main thing that I just want you to understand is it is a yoga, a bodily yoga in a sense, and that it works with anahata, the heart center, which is the meeting place of the spiritual self that is manifested through the high chakras, the higher 3 chakras, and the lower khanda, the lower bulb of chakras in the lower 3 chakras. And we'll look at that a little bit more carefully here, reviewing some of the material that we looked at last time. So I introduced this concept of orthodoxy, and interestingly, the concept of Bhakti Yoga is consistent with orthodox forms in other faith traditions. It's always kind of the safe approach. It's okay to talk about love. It's a little bit difficult when we start to talk about the physical body, especially if we talk about sexuality. It's always a little bit difficult if we start to talk about mystical insight, because that undercuts orthodox forms of approach to the divine that involve doctrine, that involve liturgy, the way that we speak to the divine or talk about the divine, that contradicts institutional structures. When we get into the mystical realm, we see that everything is God, and that we can get information from trees and animals in the sky, and that tends to undercut the priesthood, the institutional structures that attempt to control divine messages through books or through the priest hierarchy. And in some traditions, there's not a problem there. We don't see that problem in Hinduism because they've embraced the mystical traditions. We don't see that problem in Buddhism because it also embraces the mystical traditions. But when we get to the West, there's a problem. We don't deal with the animal nature. We don't think that there is revelation. We don't bank on it, at least. It's we could find minor discussions about it. We don't bank on animal or physical body experience feeding us information about the divine, nor our mystical insight that comes from revelatory states, from mystical states. These things tend to fall outside of the lines. So what we see in the orthodoxy of the West is this overemphasis on oneness, and I'm going to present this idea again to you guys. I think it's a cool one. Not a oneness which is an ultimate mystical oneness, not a oneness that comes from embracing our animal nature, which we share with all things natural in the realm of Prakriti here on this earth, but a oneness that comes from institutional ideas of one, and I'm going to focus here on Christianity, one avatar, one Messiah, Jesus, one church, at least up until the Reformation of the 1500s, the Catholic Church, one book, the Bible, one gender, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. This erroneous focus on oneness in this plane, which sweeps away the proper embrace of diversity in this plane of being. Here down below, it is all duality, it is all relativity, it is all this and that, man and woman, up and down, black and white, a realm of opposites which help us to define the kamchukas, the structures of reality, and which needs to be embraced, born with, tolerated, celebrated. Oneness comes, of course, through mystical experience. We find the absolute in the center of our conscious experience, not in the periphery where this world inhabits its many, many forms, where the divine inhabits its many, many forms. So we don't want to make that mistake like orthodoxy makes that mistake. We want to plunge into the world of heterodoxy, into this world of counterculture from which Bhakti arose. It attempted to work against the priestly structures in the Indian tradition. And I'm sure many of my listeners are of this same persuasion, that you are not embracing orthodox structures, though I'm guessing that there are many orthodox thought forms in your life that you may or may not be aware of, that you might want to work carefully to sweep away through an engagement with philosophy like this talk here, or through an engagement with meditative practices which help us get it behind all thought forms. But in the least, I'm guessing you are a rebel from your institutional church structure. There's probably not a lot of Christians out there, though I myself identify with Christ, and I'm not afraid to embrace my root tradition of the Methodist Church. I've made peace with it. Many of us are on the fly from these orthodox structures because they have betrayed us in many ways. They've shown us negative experiences. They've given us, many times, traumatic experiences, and I'm very sympathetic to that. and I'm giving you a kind of a philosophical perspective on it to help you reject it, to help you embrace this wider realm of yoga, but to know that even the orthodox systems with their limits have their place. They have a way of giving us valuable information, and even to some degree keeping us disciplined and in line in a way that human beings can be helped. So hopefully you will find peace with your tradition, or maybe you've already found peace, and that yoga is not merely a rebellion against your root tradition, be it Islam, Judaism, or any of the traditions of the Levant, or even Buddhism, whatever it may be. So here we go. No more mumbling. There are a route of paths that move us into the divine. The heart is one of them, and it is definitely centered in one chakra experience of anahata, at the center between the two main khandhas, the two main bulbs, the upper bulb and the lower bulb of our actual physically embodied experience. We might identify mind with ajna, the center between the two brows, which has to do with divine insight. We also approach to the body, the lower bulb, the lower khandhas of Muladhara, Svadhisthana, and Manipura, the lower three chakras, and then the spirit, the high Sahasrara, highest chakra, the 1,000-petaled lotus at the top of the head. But we see different traditions emphasize these different approaches to the divine with different amounts of emphasis. Of course, in the Hindu tradition, what's so lovely about it is that we find all of this wealth of what I call technological approaches, Indo-technologies, inner technologies, be they esoteric in the realm of abstract thought or esoteric in the realm of energetic, spiritual, vibratory experience, or esoteric in the realm of they're feeling something in the physical body, all internal technologies, Indo-technologies. We find the wealth of these in the Hindu tradition embraced, not put aside, though different emphases are definitely apparent. One tradition will emphasize jnana, the mind. One tradition will emphasize spirit or heart or some other approach. But we see all of them within a tolerable framework in the Hindu tradition. That's what's quite so lovely about it, and in yoga, which is an outgrowth of it. So I've given you this great image from last time where we looked at how the different aspects of the chakra system are affirmed by yoga, the animal experience in the lower chakras, and I've already made reference to this in the earlier two slides, but here we see the diagram, and the mystical states which are manifested in the upper chakras. And we see the social experience which happens in the heart. We experience ourselves in this kind of lateral dimension of horizontality, one-to-one, self to others, which is a part of most Orthodox faith traditions, and as well the exercise of the will, the exercise of morality, which we identify with Vishuddha, the throat chakra, and then the guidance of the ego into usually subdued by social structures. And at that point we point to Manipura. We see that much more in Svadhisthana, I must admit, but Manipura also has to do with working with the relationship to wealth, and dana, what we say, giving or charity, and that's also a mainstream experience that is affirmed in Orthodox traditions, especially Western Orthodox traditions, but we also see it in the East. It's kind of A-OK. It's a social way to talk about religion that we can all be comfortable with. Moral choices, charitable choices, heart-connected choices, but when we get into the mystical realm, it gets kind of out of control. When we get into the animal realm, it can get out of control. So Orthodox religion, Western and Eastern, tend to narrow the field of chakras they work with. So here we're going to jump into history and look at where this conversation with this wider realm of yoga, which embraces our full incarnational being as expressed through the chakra system, first took root in the world, actually outside of India mainly, though there definitely was a movement of the traditions into Southeast Asia, into China, before the modern era. But the jump to the West, of course, was the most significant one because it created this ongoing dialogue and encounter which has been so fruitful, conversation between East and West. And this has not been a point of mystery. Ever since Swami Vivekananda came to the West in 1893, he was full of this conversation of the West's material skills and the East's spiritual skills, and the coming together of those two hemispheres of thought, the profound focus on the outer world, which we can trace all the way back to the Western Greek traditions, even the Judaic-Christian traditions, of course, that came later. We see this in the Islamic traditions, an embrace of duality, an embrace of what we call Manichaean thinking, the separation into good and evil and the emphasis on the good that we see in the West, but the more acceptance of the wider polarity of being in the East, not a discomfort with the terms of what the West would call evil, but more a looking at the structure of reality as being one of powers, and one of cultivation of powers, where one cultivates power for success among these many kind of allegiances of the gods, power centers of the gods, or plant kingdom, or yakshas, demons, whatever. That the realm is kind of a amoral world, we see from the more Eastern traditions, not so divided into black and white, but more a way of cultivating a way through samsara, right, way through this world of incarnation to success that involves negotiating among many opposites. So Swami Vivekananda brought these ideas to the West when he came in 1893 to the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago and the World Parliament of Religions. He subsequently founded institutions here, Ramakrishna Missions, and translated the Yoga Sutras in the form of his 1896 book Raja Yoga, and taught throughout the country, becoming something of a yogi superstar, both in the country of the United States and back in India. The other main progenitor of yoga in the West is, of course, the work in the Hatha Yoga Renaissance, so well chronicled by the great scholar and living scholar and honored colleague of mine, Mark Singleton, in his book Yoga Body. In the 1920s especially, this started to accelerate, but after the 1900s, this had already started, partly in response to the impetus of Vivekananda's work. We get a host of physical culturalists, people who are attempting to create a new form of approach to physical health through the use of yoga. The spiritual elements are not dropped, but what happens in this reformulation, which is very much centered in the kingdom of Mysore and under the auspices and beneficiariness under the wealth of King Wodir in Mysore, was a new way of doing yoga that strongly emphasized the body and brought the asanas into prominence. It was this laboratory that was mainly happening in Mysore, but also happening up in Rishikesh through Swami Shivananda, happening over in the east through Vishnu Ghosh, happening in the kingdom of Aoun through Bhavan Ropant, happening in Bangalore through the gyms of Kola Venkatesh Iyer and his lieutenants like Sundaram and others, happening all over India in this period, partly as a push towards making the youth of India healthy so that they could fight against the British Raj, British rule, in the work for independence. But what it ended up doing, of course, in the larger sense, was refocusing on asana as a more exclusive technology for self-transformation. And that created a strong appeal for the material West, because we are more perhaps receptive to the lower chakra approaches, most of us, and it just feels good to work our bodies. So this kind of lower chakra animal engaging, in animal nature engaging system of Hatha Yoga, with its physical postures and the beauty of the postures and their dividends of health, appealed to the West and especially appealed to women, and has found root in the modern postural yoga tradition that we'll say a little bit more later. The other thing about later, as we kind of weave Hatha Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, and Tantra Yoga together, the other thing that I want to point to, of course, is the birth of Bhakti Yoga in the West, which has been a late arrival. More something that came in the 1960s in the work of Yogi Bhajan and the leader of the Hare Krishna movement, Bhaktivedanta Prabhupada. But as we'll see, it also came through in Krishnamacharya's yoga. But I just want to point to this development and sketch it in brief before we go into it more deeply. There was a great movement towards large pop festivals, pop music festivals, mostly rock and roll festivals, but some jazz and leaders were also in them in the 1960s. And these early on started to integrate actually the devotional approach to the divine, mainly through the person of Yogi Bhajan, who's I think is in my next slide, 2 slides down maybe. Yogi Bhajan, who came to America in 1968, late 1968, and began his deeper work in 1969, and was able actually to seed some of the efforts that happened at Woodstock. But Yogi Bhajan was appearing at a lot of these big music festivals because his tradition of Sikhism leaned heavily on the Bhakti tradition. We'll talk a little bit more about that mainly in the second hour. But getting a little bit ahead of myself, today we have this strongly full-flowered Bhakti Yoga festival tradition that is modern, that is growing all the time. And here we see arrangement of many of the major festivals, the Omega Chant Fest in Rhinebeck, New York, Satnam Fest. We're appearing in 3 locations of Asta and Yoga and Chant Fest. Of course, the big one, Joshua Tree's Bhakti Fest, which happens twice a year with the Shakti Fest in Joshua Tree, and then in Wisconsin. There's also the Midwest Bhakti Fest, I guess it is. There are other festival which is also devoted to Bhakti Yoga. 3 big festivals put on by them. And then we've got Chantalanta, you've got Rock the Bhakti in Sarasota, Florida, Moksha Fest in Santa Monica. Just a big wash of these things is what I want to point to. It's become a mainline experience in the modern Hatha Yoga tradition because there's this huge overlap. All of these festivals are also Hatha Yoga festivals. But I want to kind of go back a little bit in history before we go way back in history and just point to what happened at Woodstock, which is the iconic music festival that we all kind of know. Happened in August of 1969, and few people know it, but Bhakti Fest was born there, and even our modern yoga movement that emerged in the baby boomer era really was born there too. We'll look at this more carefully actually in this first hour. The Sridhar Silberfein, who was involved in the production, he was one of the 4 people who helped produce Woodstock, was given the role of bringing a spiritual element to the festival. As you know, a 500,000 person festival out on a dairy farm in upstate New York. The iconic festival, which was bridged as an Aquarian Age event, and it really did play out that way, partly through Sridhar Silberfein's work. He pledged in that moment in 1969 to bring forth a chanting festival for God, for divinity, and it happened 40 years later in the audition of Bhakti Fest in 2009. But Silberfein was instrumental in Woodstock and bringing this element because he, at that point, was a follower of Satchidananda, who was a chief disciple of Swami Shivananda, who we saw in that previous slide of the Hatha Yoga Renaissance. Swami Shivananda was a former doctor and also emphasized Hatha Yoga among his disciples. When Satchidananda came to America in 1966 and started to gather disciples, he started teaching Hatha Yoga. He published a book called Integral Yoga Hatha, in which he displayed his posture mastery. But Silberfein was a follower of Satchidananda, and knowing that there would be value in bringing a spiritual element to Woodstock, he helicoptered him in, very, very cool, and had him speak. And as we saw in that previous slide, you see the picture there of Satchidananda in the middle, and you see some of his followers there practicing yoga. So yoga was being incubated at Woodstock, partly through Silverfein's work. He brought Satchidananda to the stage in the opening act, and he led the people in Om and gave a little bit of a talk before anybody had even performed any rock and roll on stage at Woodstock. So big imprint he made, and as we'll also see, Tom Law, anyway, Yogi Bhajan and Satchidananda got together later on, two big gurus who were doing good work in the West. They both practiced, I spelled practiced wrong, both their forms of yoga were practiced at Woodstock. Yogi Bhajan, 1929 to 2004, brought Bhakti chanting to America as well. Huge part, devotional part of his Kundalini yoga practice, and bhajan, his name Yogi Bhajan even refers to that. A bhajan is a sacred song. Bhaktivedanta Prabhupada was a follower of Chaitanya, who brought worship, a great saint from the 15th century, and he brought his form of chanting the name of Krishna to America and founded the International Society for Krishna Consciousness in July of 1966 in New York City, and that is probably the biggest movement of Bhakti to the West, and his followers have been involved in Shakti Fest and Bhakti Fest and these other devotional festivals. Of course, they all look back to the Bhagavad Gita, and here we get a little bit into the history of the practice, but there was something else there I wanted to show you before we went there. I think I'm going to go back a little bit, and I'm not seeing the technical error there, and we're going to bounce back to where we started. I mistakenly hit escape, and I forgot that when you hit escape, the recording ends. So I couldn't find that video is what I was saying, but we'll include it in the next hour. And what's cool about it is it shows Tom Law teaching Kundalini Yoga from the stage of Woodstock, a very rare, cool footage, and he does it in such an open-hearted way. And what I was pointing to is that just like we had Silverfein bringing Satchidananda to Woodstock and speaking from the stage and making the strong imprint on people of Bhakti Yoga through his devotional conversation, bringing people into chanting Om, we also had a lot of work of Kundalini Yoga teachers, more than Tom Law at Woodstock, and he taught yoga from the stage of Woodstock, and we actually see it in this video. Anytime the crowd was a little bit restless and the acts were moving slowly, he would get up on stage and teach all these people Kundalini Yoga. 500,000 people, at least some number of them, were watching that particular act. So a huge kind of seeding of modern postural yoga in the West happened at Woodstock. We don't often think of it as a yoga event, but it was a yoga event. Talked a little bit about Yogi Bhajan and his name meaning bhajan, meaning song, and he brought Bhakti chanting through Kundalini Yoga strongly into the West, tied to a form of physical practice, his asana practice of Kundalini practice, a kind of unusual form, unlike the other more vinyasa-style forms that most people know. As I say, he came to America in 68, really got going in 69. Bhaktivedanta Prabhupada came in 65, and in 1966, July of 1966, founded International Society of Krishna Consciousness. He died in 1977, so he was born in 1896, so he's quite old when he came to America. Spent the last 12 years of his life traveling the world and bringing the devotional practice of the Hare Krishnas to the planet. Of course, he had some high-profile people join in with him, mainly the Beatles, who even included his chant in one of their songs. Of course, they looked back to the Bhagavad Gita, and the Bhagavad Gita is an interesting text that brings in Bhakti. We're going to actually look at this a little bit more closely. Brings in Bhakti mainly through the elevation of Krishna as the one God, as the focus of devotional practice. It tells a story of the relationship of Arjuna and Krishna, and many of you out there know it. I'm not going to go into too deeply. And it comes out of the movement of the Bhagavatas, who were an early sect of devotional practitioners who were active around the early Common Era, around the birth of Christ, and their influence on the elevation of Krishna as the all-God probably touched the writer of the Bhagavad Gita, and we'll unfold that. And that is also, of course, Prabhupada's tradition, the tradition of Chaitanya, who looked back to these early bhaktas. Chaitanya was a great teacher of the 15th century. He looked back to these early bhaktas of the early Common Era who had composed the Bhagavad Gita and elevated Krishna. Of course, Bhaktivedanta Prabhupada was seen as a reincarnation of Chaitanya, and of course looked back through this whole lineage to the early Common Era as well. Few know that Krishnamacharya, the great teacher of modern postural yoga, who we saw on that earlier side of the Hatha Yoga Renaissance in the upper right, doing Pinchamayurasana, was mainly a bhakta. We think of him as an intellectual, a scholar, those of who know something about his tradition, and here we see a picture of him very young with his burning eyes, which he was so famous for. But we don't think of him as a bhakta, but he was a bhakta. He came from the Vaishnava tradition, which was purely bhakta. He looked to Nata Muni as the founder of his sect, the Thenkali Iyengars, who was the very person who took the songs of the Alvars, the singer saints from the 5th to 10th century, and composed them into the Divya Prabhanandam, the great text of the Vaishnavite tradition. He's the first saint of that tradition, and it was exclusively focused on bhakti, and it was only until Ramanuja came along about 200 years later and created a theology behind the practice that it became much more orthodox. So Krishnamacharya, the great teacher of practical yoga, shares Prabhupada's lineage because Prabhupada goes back through Chaitanya to Nata Muni, and Krishnamacharya breaks off. His tradition breaks off. He doesn't look through Chaitanya to Nata Muni, but he looks through his own lineage to this great saint Nata Muni of the 9th century, who founded Vaishnavism. Both these men are Vaishnavites. Krishnamacharya was a lifelong bhakta, and here we see some of his practices. He would get up at 2 a.m. in the morning and do all of his devotional practices to his form of Vishnu. He was a Vaishnavite, which means he worshipped Vishnu. He would spend a few hours doing this before he did anything in the morning. In bed by 8 o'clock, up at 2 a.m., here we see these pictures of him. We can see actually how short he was. Pictures taken by his son, TKV Desikachar, of him doing these different ablutions, these different bowing practices, different forms of Surya Namaskar that all praise Narayana, a certain form of Vishnu, which was his sex, S-E-C-T-S, sex form of Vishnu that they looked at. Vishnu has a god who has many forms. And just to look a little bit more carefully at Krishnamacharya and his lineage, he was a Thenkali Iyengar, as I say. There was two sects, the Venkali tradition and the Thenkali tradition, two traditions that broke off from the teachings of Nata Muni. The Thenkalis were the southern sect, and they emphasized what we call vernacular languages, not such a big emphasis on Sanskrit, and they were more populist tradition, which embraced the softening of caste association, much more populist, much more all-embracing. This was Krishnamacharya's tradition, and we see it in the head marking that he had. It is the sect mark of the Ramanujis, which means they follow Ramanuja, the guy I mentioned, the theologian of the 10th century. And they also follow Ramanandi, who was also a theologian of that time. And, of course, Krishnamacharya had married Iyengar, the great teacher of the 20th century sister, Amagiriyama, who was 11 years old in 1925. A woman in those days typically married at the age of 11. Hard to believe, but that was Hindu tradition. Of course, he didn't have children until she was 18, which is an interesting thought, not until the early 30s. But both of these men were a part of a similar sect, and they had an alliance between their families. So Krishnamacharya married into Iyengar's family in 1925. It was seen to be an honorable alliance, and they shared their orientation. Of course, the name of Iyengar, we see in his name, BKS Iyengar, Belur Krishnamachar, same name. Sundararaja Iyengar, BKS Iyengar, means teacher or noble one. And as we see, they wear similar caste markings, so there's a variance of the caste markings they wear, and the abbreviated form that Iyengar wore was the Sri Charanam, just a single line down the middle of the brow, and the much more elaborate Sri Vaishnavite symbol, and we see the Sri, the red line in the middle, that is symbolic of Sri, the goddess, Lakshmi, and then the two outside lines are the foot imprint of Vishnu, which comes from this story of Vishnu where he was a dwarf and he took these 3 giant strides to encompass the universe. A little theological story which leads to the forehead markings that we see on both Krishnamacharya and his brother-in-law and student BKS Iyengar. The Sri Charanam and the Urdhva Pundra. Lifelong bhakti. Here we see him in his later years, perhaps his 90s. Jumping right along, Bhagavad Gita. And I've already mentioned this, Ramanuja and Nathamuni were the theologians that were looked to both by Bhaktivedanta Prabhupada and Krishnamacharya, these people who influenced our Western yoga traditions so strongly. And we see the expression of bhakti devotional practice in Krishnamacharya's writing of a commentary on the Yoga Sutras. The Yoga Sutras, of course, was born in that same cauldron that gave birth to both Tantra and Bhakti in the early Common Era. As I said, we had these early Bhakti cults that came in the early Common Era around the time of Christ. We also had the Pashupats, who were early cult members who were experimenting with forms of Tantra. And then, of course, we had the Yoga Sutra, which was produced in the early 4th century. So in the early 4th century, we get these kind of 3 movements all getting up to steam. Of course, they will have this big shift in the Middle Ages after the Islamic invasions and the fading of Tantra, and we'll get to that in the next part of the lecture. But here we see this great focus of Krishnamacharya on the Yoga Sutras. He takes it up into the tradition of Hatha Yoga and steers its practice, its meditative practices, towards informing Hatha Yoga practice and informing householder practice for those of us like you and me who have not taken our full yogi vows and are still involved with family, involved with occupation, involved with our communities, involved in the real world. We are doing householder yoga, and Krishnamacharya steered the Yoga Sutras towards addressing our concerns, but he also emphasized that it was a bhakti text, and that is a strong and powerful and unusual reading of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. But that is what he did. He wrote a commentary called Yoga Vali, and he gave a wholly devotional spin to the Yoga Sutras. This book was published in 1940. It's hard to get a hold of. I believe it was written in Tamil, and it's just beginning to be translated. But it is a testament to the bhakti disposition of the Vaishnavite practice of Krishnamacharya. Looked back to this Vaishnavite saint, this devotional saint of Nathamuni. This slide is a little bit misplaced. I meant to say that Ramanuja and Nathamuni contributed to the Bhakti revolution that came after the fading of Tantra. We'll look at that more carefully in the next hour. And I've already kind of referred to this part of it, getting a little bit ahead of myself, because the Pashupats, the Kalamuks, and the Lingayats were all early sects of outlier monks and yogis who were doing bizarre, confrontive, what we call antinomian practices, which were unorthodox, which involved eating strange substances, which involved drinking from skull bowls, and involved in strange acts of eating human brains and cannibalism, and living in the cremation grounds and smearing themselves with holy ash, because holy ash was said to be this kind of inert substance which approached the inert quality of consciousness, which reflected Shiva's being. A lot of weird theological connections here. But these strange sects of yogis were active in the early Common Era, and it's from their practices which Tantra will draw its new creative, confrontive approach to religiosity. And the Bhakta sects of that period embrace this term Bhakti to describe what they were up to, and we talked a little bit about this in the last lecture as well. And the most interesting thing about this word Bhakti is that it means what it means, and it means its opposite. We'll review this again in this lecture. As we can see at the beginning, it says distribution, partition, separation. And we don't think of Bhakti as being separation. We think of it as being like a yoga, a union, a dissolving into the divine. And of course it is that too. As we go down, halfway down, it says attachment, devotion, fondness for, devotion to. So trust, homage, worship, piety, faith or love, which are all kind of union acts of yoga. And that is, of course, the most prominent aspect of Bhakti yoga. It's this ecstatic surrender to the divine. And what it involves is holding the polarity of embodiment in relationship to the ultimacy of absolute awareness, and feeling this yearning, this openness that is created from our limited state of knowledge and awareness, in confrontation with the ultimate state of awareness, which we can feel in a kind of alchemical experience in the midst of powerful chant. Bhakti, because of its very definition, defines in a very adept way that relationship of yearning for something that will not come. And that's the form in which it's often described as. It's this waiting, like a lover that yearns for the departed other, who is a little bit unavailable. There is that gap that happens between the absolute divine and the relative bhakta, the relevant worshipper, relative, I should say, in their embodied state, in their separated state from ultimacy, which is an idea that frames the human condition. But what the Bhaktas did is they, and I'll repeat this again in the next hour, but let's say it here and now, is the Bhaktas took this formula of striving that we saw in the early Lingayat and Pashupat sects, this powerful striving of the whole striving tradition, the Shramana tradition from the Upanishadic era that came before the birth of Christ, in those 1,000 years before the birth of Christ, this attempt to imitate God, to become powerful like God. And it was actually often achieved by these hard-working yogis working with their tapasic, heat-building practices. They dissolved their relative self and became one with the divine, and gained siddhis, gained these yogic powers, these miraculous powers. That is a path that we see strongly foregrounded in the Tantric tradition. But what the Bhaktis did in the aftermath of the Islamic invasions is they surrendered that attempt to bring the divine into the mundane, into their body by becoming God, and surrender their relative conditions They stopped embracing the hard path, and they said, you know what, we're limited. We're not going to become God other than in this moment of embrace of our communion with God through chant and song. Heart-centered practice that everybody can do, not a weird practice that you have to do alone and in secret because it's esoteric and it involves confrontational things that everyday society is not going to be comfortable with. You can do singing and chanting out in public. You can embrace your merely limited self. You can feel this yearning for the divine, and in that moment of ecstasy of chant, you can find those rare moments of union, and you just accept that limitedness of your connection to the divine. That's the new Bhakti formula, the theology behind it, which contradicts the Tantric tradition which preceded it. So we see these bhaktis that start to emerge in the late Middle Ages. And as I say, it's a reaction to Tantra. And to just frame this larger approach that we see in the Hindu tradition, what we need to know in all of these movements of Tantra and Hatha and Bhakti is they were responding to the framework that emerged in the middle period, the middle millennium before the Common Era. This idea that we get in the philosophical turn of the Upanishads that describes our human condition as one of living in samsara, living in the school of life, which is difficult, where we have karmic residues which result from our ethical acts and which we must relieve through yogic practices to attain a healthy rebirth, or the dissolution of the cycle of death and rebirth. That is the way in which human life is described throughout the many, many philosophical and practice traditions of the Hindu tradition, and which Bhakti, Hatha, and Tantra all attempt to solve. So they solve for karma in many different ways. And we are going to mainly focus in these lectures on, and have focused, as you can see so far, on that tradition that comes through the Bhagavatas and the Bhagavad Gita. But the 4 stages of life is a part of it when we look at becoming a brahmacharya before we become a grahastha and a householder, and then a wandering saint, the last 2 stages of life, to the purusharthas, the 4 goals of life, the highest of which is moksha, liberation, and then this division between brahmana and shramana, yogi and householder, which get coalesced in the Tantra tradition, where you become a secret yogi and you do your extreme practices away from the public eye. These are all inventive ways in which the Hindu tradition has attempted to solve this problem of karma, and the deeper investigation of these divergent paths is not a part of this lecture, but I just wanted to refer to it in passing as we move forward. This last slide that we have, we're about at the end of our first hour talk, gives us an opportunity to focus on the male and female polarities, the feminine and masculine polarities, which inhabit every human psychology, every human mind and experience. We have the aspects of yielding and caring and nurturing, which we identify with the feminine polarity. We have the aspects of assertion and narrowing the personality and focus and achievement, which we identify with the masculine aspect of the person. And in the yogi tradition, these are brought into union in a single person. The Shakti and Shiva aspects of the personality, the extroverted and introverted aspects, the downward moving Shakti energy, the upward moving Shiva energy, are brought into union through these extreme Hatha, forceful practices that we see in the Shramana Striver tradition, bringing the union of feminine and masculine together into a single body, in which are represented by the Ardhanarishvara, that person that you see on the left, which is half Shiva and Shakti. But in the orthodox traditions, of which Bhakti is a part, that union is not brought about in a single human body. Orthodoxy is embraced. Love is embraced. Kama, the form of earthly love and desire, is embraced through the union of male and female. But of course, we update this to the current tradition, where we have unions of the same gender, but still within those unions we see the meeting of the feminine and the masculine in the body-to-body experience, in the worldly experience of physical love. So the Bhakti tradition does not attempt to do this hard work of Hatha or the Shramana traditions, but it seeks a feminine self in relationship to the masculine self of the divine. This is mainly what we see expressed, even if the god that is being worshipped is a Devi, is a Shakti. There is a relationship of surrender, a relationship of passivity, a relationship of allowing oneself to be taken in the feminine role in relationship to the divine. So the Bhakta doesn't do the hard work of energetic alchemy that is a kind of ultimate shift that comes about through the hard practices of meditation and tapas and cleansing that comes through Hatha Yoga or different energetic applications, but finds it in a kind of emotional disposition. And we see this in the life of Ramakrishna, who was the saint who taught Vivekananda, who we saw early on. He went through a period of his life, through his relationship to Krishna, that he dressed as a bhakta, he dressed as Radha, he dressed as a woman, and for many, many months he worshipped Krishna by going whole hog and putting on the masquerade of a woman to respond to Krishna as a devotee, to respond and enlarge his feminine self so that he could surrender to the more active self of the Godhead. So in this primary option, which in the classical sense, in the sort of pre-Bhakta, pre-Tantra sense, was seen as choosing between orthodox life, what we call the life of the Brahmana, or the unorthodox life, the life of the Shramana. You had to decide what you were going to do with your sexual force, your vital force, your life force. Were you going to turn it inward and integrate male and female polarities and attempt to get out of this cycle of life and death and samsara in one lifetime? Or were you going to attempt to do the lessons of life that come through involvement with a member of the opposite sex and spousal relationships and work and community? These were the two life options which were primarily given in the early Common Era, and Bhakti gives its own little twist to it by saying that in the relationship to the divine, through this surrendering work of kirtan, through the singing of the heart, through the exploration of the middle chakra of Anahata, we embrace a polarity to the divine which is feminine. And of course, for men, this is a greater challenge because many men, not all men, of course, are defined through their masculine aspect. But the polarities of male and female play out in the Bhakti tradition in this way. So that is the first hour of our masterclass. It seemed to go rather quick, and I hope it planted some seeds for our next masterclass, which we'll be recording perhaps in the morning. It's gotten late here on this Wednesday night. I bid you goodbye as we give a little boom on our blast atom bomb at the end of this lecture. Kaboom! And Shavasana with results. Thank you for your kind attention and listening. Hari Om Tat Sat. I'm signing off for now, and I look forward to speaking to you in the next hour. Be well. Prayers to Saraswati. I think we're live here. My recording window just disappeared. But welcome to our second masterclass in Bhakti, Hatha, Yoga, and Tantra. I'm looking forward to this material. I've been excited about this research. Let's get right into it. A bit of a pause to bow to your teachers and to my teachers. I am honored by the downloads I have received from many people, from many traditions, and they contribute to the teaching that I offer you today. So what I want to kind of start with is I want to jump right back, even though we talked about the modern period in the last master class. In this one, we're going to review an earlier time period and then move forward again. And we'll cover some of the same material we looked at last time, but it will be helpful reiteration for you, I'm hoping. So the gods of the Vedas. Here we see an image of a range of the deities that we find in these old texts that go back about 1,500 years before the Common Era, about 3,500 years back from our day. And the reason I wanted to highlight these gods is because they presented a different relationship in the yoga tradition, sort of the pre-yoga tradition, we might say, between the people and their experience of the deity, the experience of the divine. This, of course, was a kind of golden age period in which people were in a different psychological set. They did not have such strong ego boundaries, and they related to the deities, to ghosts, to spirits, to animals in a much more permeable way because their ego boundaries were more shallow. We see this in Iliad and Odyssey in that psychological period of history as well. But the nature of the god was different in the Vedic society, and he or she was more a god on high, a kind of power center that could be related to as a friend, but that was not the primary relationship. It was more a relationship of supplicant to master. The gods had profound powers, and people were interested in changing the nature of their circumstances, having usually more wealth or more health or more children or more cattle, greater status in society, etc., etc. And so they besought the gods through ritual practices for these boons. The gods were powerful figures. They were not necessarily companion figures, but that will shift when we get into the Bhakti period, and we'll look at that more closely. So this period of the Upanishads follows the Vedic period. The Upanishads articulated a different philosophy of life, one that was more analytical, one that was more transcendental, an attempt to look at the ultimate aims of human existence, to look at the fate of human beings after death. And in this period, from about 800 years before the Common Era onward, the Common Era beginning with the birth of Christ, what we often call AD, 800 years before the Common Era, we get the discussion of yoga. That's the most significant thing about the Upanishads. We get a existential relationship to existence that focuses on karma and rebirth. And what it gives birth to in relationship to our discussion is this figure of the sannyasi. We had proto-yogis in the Vedic tradition, the Kesans, the Vrachyas, figures who were actually kind of in a friend relationship to the gods. But in the Upanishads, we get individuals who are not so much in relationship to the gods, but in relationship to practices, mainly the meditative practices, simple sitting practices, definitely sitting upright, definitely practices like Padmasana, though we don't get them described. Breathing practices are described, states of mind are described. Om chanting is described as a technology. So we get a range of technologies which are focused on self-transformation. And out of this new philosophical disposition to life and the recognition that the resolution of your karmic debt is paramount, we get a whole class of individuals we call shramanas, strivers, people who have devoted themselves to yogic practices exclusively. They have dropped away from householder life. The Buddha was such a figure, of course, and Mahavira, the one who started the Jains, was such a figure. And then we get sages, of course, and other powerful figures in the tradition, like Yajnavalkya in the Brahmanical tradition. These figures are part of the Shramana class, part of the striver class. People have devoted themselves to realization, and the high aim of this class of individuals, this set of religious virtuosos in the Hindu tradition, is not to become merely a saint, but to become equal with God through hard shramana, striver-like practices. And that will set a kind of template for a personality that will be succeeded or shifted in the Bhakti traditions. So we have this figure, as I say, of the lone sannyasin, the crazy guy who's living in the cremation grounds, who's eating brains out of a skull, who's drinking liquor, who's smearing himself with ash, who's acting bizarre in public. These are all technologies, all ways in which this individual breaks their relationship to social mindsets, to consensus consciousness, and opens up his or her mind to the divine. One way to go, not a way for everybody. But things begin to shift a bit when we get the production of the Svetasvatara Upanishad, and I have spelled that wrong. It should be SVE rather than SEV. Svetasvatara Upanishad, the Upanishad of the white horse or the white donkey, which suggests that the senses, the horses are often identified with the senses, the indriyas, as they're called in Samkhya philosophy. The 5 empirical senses are cleansed, and we look at them. They're often stated metaphorically as our senses. So Svetasvatara Upanishad refers to a certain sage whose senses were cleansed, who gave this download about Rudra Shiva. Shiva, of course, is the god that many of you probably know. You know that he is the Lord of Yogis. You know he's the wild guy who hangs out in the Himalayas. We know that he's the guy who created warrior posture through his form of Virabhadrasana, destroying his father's ritual in that great myth where he kind of takes over the tradition in the form of the yogi. So he is kind of this storm god, this healing god in the ancient tradition, but he kind of gets an uptick. He gets a kind of a promotion in Svetasvatara Upanishad, because Svetasvatara Upanishad emphasizes oneness, the oneness of Shiva, the dominance of Shiva as the all-god, as the Lord of all creation, who is behind all the forms of the Godhead. He is Vishnu. He is what will later be Krishna. He is Brahma. The Trimurti, the 3 forms of the God, are really just one God. This is Shiva. And so Svetasvatara Upanishad ushers in a new relationship to the gods, not what we will get later in the full-blown Bhakti tradition, but a step towards it, in that we have a monotheism, much like the monotheism that we see in the traditions of the Levant and the Abrahamic traditions of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And this is rather new in the Hindu tradition. Before that, the pantheon of the gods was accepted. You approach this god for this purpose, you approach this other god for another purpose. There wasn't some idea that just one god was behind it all. So this creates a new sectarian disposition. We start to get individuals who are setting up one god as the all-god and focusing all of their attention on Vishnu or Brahma or Shiva. We have actually strong evidence for the traditions of worshipping Vishnu and worshipping Shiva, but not so much worshipping Brahma. He kind of falls away. But Svetasvatara Upanishad is primarily interested in promoting Shiva as the all-god, a new development in the religiosity of the tradition. So here he is, Shiva, with his third eye that opens up and destroys the world. He is the yogi, which is significant for our Hatha yoga tradition. And it's interesting that they chose such a god. I think it's interesting that they chose this god. Later, of course, they'll choose Vishnu much more strongly, the householder god, and it will become a mainstream tradition. But this early tradition of monotheism looks to Shiva, who is an outlier god, sort of a tantric figure, even in Svetasvatara Upanishad, who gets elevated as this trickster, stormbringer, medicine figure to the preeminence of monotheism in the Hindu tradition, a new development. And so following soon after this, we have evidence of the Bhagavatas. And so the Bhagavatas are figures who are praising Krishna. They're from the area of Vrindavan, sort of in the central part of India, slightly to the west. And they are centered in this area of Madura. They're part of the Yamuna clan, and the Yamuna clan if you might know from reading Bhagavad Gita, is the clan of Krishna as he becomes a legendary figure in the long tale of the Mahabharata. We have evidence, really interesting evidence of the Bhagavata from the late 2nd century in a column that was set up in northern India by actually a Greek fellow who was an ambassador to a kingdom, a Hindu kingdom, and he claims to be a Bhagavata. This is about the year 131 before the Common Era. So we have evidence of the Bhagavatas and a conversion to the Bhagavata way from a Westerner. We can call the Greeks Westerners in that period, and I think we can. In the late 2nd century, of course, this Bhagavata cult accelerates more in the Common Era, and it is said to contribute to the theology, to the philosophy of Bhakti Yoga, of devotion to the one figure of the Godhead that is expressed so strongly in the Bhagavad Gita, the text that was written in the early 4th century, and which is one chapter of the larger tale of the Mahabharata, the story of two bands of brothers fighting for an important kingdom. So this ushers in the era of Itihasa Purana, the story cycles of the gods, in which single gods are elevated as monotheistic. So we get the Devi, the traditions of worshipping the goddess. We get the traditions of worshipping Hanuman. We get the traditions of worshipping Ganesha, and of course Shiva, and the forms of Vishnu, such as his forms as Krishna or Vasudeva. These Puranas are story cycles which accelerate as we move towards the Middle Ages, and alongside them are these devotional traditions. This is the scriptural basis for the devotional bhakti traditions. It's not so much a Sanskrit tradition. It is more a populist tradition. It's a tradition of the people in the street telling stories orally. As the tradition moves forward, these stories get to be recorded in kind of quasi-scriptural form. These stories take on holy value. As we know, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, these story cycles, the stories of Rama reclaiming Sita, the stories of the Kauravas and the Pandavas fighting in the Mahabharata. These, of course, are holy story cycles of lengthy poetry. The Mahabharata is over 100,000 verses. These form the kind of initial examples of the Puranas. And then as we move forward through Hindu and Indian history, we get more and more of these Puranas. And in many of these Puranas, we get stories about the efficacy of yoga. But the primary thrust, of course, is Bhakti Yoga, devotional practice. About the time of the 5th century, we start to get evidence of Tantra. And Tantra is kind of our interlude. It's the place that we stop into in this larger story of the Bhakti traditions unfolding. It emerges in the 5th century. We start to get texts in the 5th century, and the 4th century we start to have evidence of Tantra, and then texts in the 5th century. It is a tradition that moves forward both in Buddhism and Hinduism. It is a tradition that emphasizes unusual practices based on the dispositional focus of the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita switched the emphasis from practices, especially ritual practices, to the inner attitude, the kind of knowledge aspect or devotional aspect of the practitioner, and suggested that this was key to the unfolding of salvation. It wasn't so much an issue of what you did, but how you did it and how you felt inside while you did it. So that opens up this vast creativity of Tantra, and Tantra thrives for many centuries, from as I say, 4th, 5th century up into the year about 1100, when the Muslim invasions start to erode the centrality of Tantra, starts to undermine the kingships which support it and the monasteries which support it. But Tantra gives us some devotional elements. Of course, it elevates the goddess and it elevates Shiva, and we get many texts in which Shiva is speaking and the goddess is speaking. Not so much a tradition that is focused on forms of Vishnu, which will be central to the Bhakti tradition, but there are some Vaishnavite traditions. And of course, this whole time that Tantra is evolving, Bhakti is also evolving with its various saints and its various alvars, its singer saints who travel the countryside, and this is mostly happening in Tamil Nadu in the south and the west. So one of the biggest beefs we have with the Hindu tradition, that part of it that makes us uncomfortable, is this aspect of caste, this idea that someone can be born into a single social station and they are locked in it for the rest of our life. In the West, we are an egalitarian society. We see that everybody has an equal opportunity to attain whatever they would like to in their lifetime. We focus on self-actualization as a keynote of our culture. So this is very offensive to us, this idea that you might be born into some class and it would be unbroken for your whole life. This tradition is very old in Hinduism. It reaches clear back into the Vedas, when the conquering Aryan people started to classify those who they conquered. The idea of Varna means color, so it very much was like apartheid. It was a prejudicial system which was institutionalized. There will be apologists for the Hindu tradition which will say, oh no, it wasn't that rigid, that everybody had the opportunity to move into different castes, but that is not so much supported by scholarship, that idea. It's a very kind idea, but not one that really hit the ground. What we see in the Hindu-Indian tradition is that caste is very stationary for those people who are a part of it. You are born as a Sudra, a member of the worker class. You are born as a Vaishya, a member of the merchant class. You are born as a Kshatriya, a member of the administrative, governmental warrior class. You are born as a Brahmin, a member of the priestly caste, and you pretty much stay in that caste for your whole lifetime. Of course, this has its benefits in that when you know what your fate is in this material world, you surrender to it and you're happy. You're not so much tortured by possibility like we are in the West. I, of course, probably would not choose to be born in the Varna system, and most of in the West would think of it as a bummer. But often, when you travel to the East, people seem to be often happier than us, so we might question the value of one social system as opposed to another. Each system, of course, has its advantages and its disadvantages. And the reason I want to foreground the Varnas here is that in both Bhakti and in Tantra, we get a dissolution of the rigidity of the Varnas. And as you can hear the people chattering outside here in the Hindu culture of Ubud, where the Varnas are also a part of our culture. Little voice from the background. But as I was saying, the tradition of Bhakti and the tradition of Tantra soften the Varnas in their own respective ways. In the Tantra tradition, what we see is this development of Kula, and we touched on this in the free seminar. The Kula is the secret space in which members of different Varnas, different castes, come together to do extreme practices in an attempt to imitate the sannyasi, the shramana tradition, the extreme tradition of the outlier ascetics, but to do it in private, away from the prying eyes of Orthodox society, who wouldn't understand the esotericism, the weird things that people were doing in the Kaula practices, the Kaulite practices of the tantric tradition. So that's how Tantra dissolved or softened the Varnas. In the Bhakti tradition, it's a little bit of a different formula. I won't go there quite yet. In that the people are brought together in the public sphere in group chanting, where the Varnas are all free to explore the devotional relationship to the Godhead as one. We'll explore that more as we move forward. But some of the aspects of Tantra that I want to emphasize are this element of mantra that takes on a different form in Tantra, which is not like the work of sound in the Bhakti tradition. And we'll point to two ways in which this Sabda Yoga, sound yoga, or Nada Yoga took its form. Here in this diagram, we see it as an expression of the aspects of the subtle body. The 50 phonemes of the Sanskrit alphabet were said to be the sounds that were the building blocks of the universe, the harmonies, the vibrations, which built material reality, and therefore, of course, the human body was structured on the same basis, and those 50 phonemes are found in the petals of the chakras. So these sound yogas developed within the Tantric tradition, which attempted to harmonize with the different vibrations in the petals of the chakras and the dalas, as we call them, of the chakras, the petals of the chakras, and to activate them, to unfold them, to have these lotuses, these flowers of the chakras with their various dalas, their various petals, unfold through the use of sound yogas. That's one way in which this Sabda Yoga took form in the Tantra tradition. The other way in which it took form was through individual mantra, not group mantras that were sung together, though we did see that happening, but more individual mantras in which a guru analyzes the harmonic disposition of his chela, of his or her chela, his student, and gives them a sound formula, the sound formula which they will use to transform their karmic disposition. So a mantra was specific, a mantra was creative, a mantra was designed by a guru by his or her insight into their student. So Sabda Yoga taking two different forms, individual mantra and esoteric mantra, which opens up the chakra system. Okay. Keynotes of Tantra philosophy. This lecture is a bit about Tantra, so we're going to talk a little bit about Tantra in order to give us a little bit of understanding of the contrast to Bhakti Yoga. Just checking my time here, got a little bit distracted, sorry. So here we have 5 elements that are keynotes of Tantric philosophy. And they are, I highlight them here, they are Body, Spanda, Shri, male, female polarity, and Guru. These pieces will have their own playing out in the tradition of Bhakti, and we'll unfold that a little bit later in the lecture. Keynotes of Tantric philosophy. So as we get this emphasis on the material world, its divinity through the manifestation of Spanda, everything is seen as the vibrating divinity of the Godhead, actually the goddess, in this reconception of samsara, of material reality in the Tantric tradition. We make this world divine, and therefore the body in it is also divine, and it's said to contain all realities. It's said to contain all possibilities for realization. This focus on the body brings about Kundalini Vidya, Kundalini science, where we start to understand the possibilities for enlightenment that come through the awakening of Kundalini and the piercing of the chakra system, among other functions that it initiates. This idea of Shri comes in, this idea that all of material reality is beautiful. It shines with the tessellation, the excitement of the goddess. We get an emphasis on male-female polarity, the duality of the universe expressed in terms of the feminine polarity and masculine polarity, and these are resolved in some of the sexual yogas that we see practiced in Tantra. And then the larger emphasis on the guru. The guru is an expression of merit, not so much of lineage as we see in the traditional orthodox priestly Brahmanical tradition, where the stationship of teacher is handed down from father to son, usually from priest to the upstart priest, the priest that is being brought up along. The gurus in the tantric tradition come from all social classes, and they earn their position through the merit of their realization. Okay. Secrecy, containment, ecstasy. We saw this slide in the previous conversation in our free e-course. I emphasize these three aspects that we find in both Tantra and Bhakti and Hatha Yoga. Secrecy, of course, takes the form in the form of Kula in Tantra, the secret practices of extreme esotericism. In Hatha Yoga, it takes the form of keeping your own individual practice hidden from those who would be curious just for prurient interest. And in the Bhakti tradition, it takes the form of your secret personal relationship to the gods, sort of like what we see in the Christian tradition, the personal relationship to Jesus, as is often said. These energies are contained very explicitly in Hatha Yoga through the practices of sealing the body through the bandhas. In the tantric tradition, the sense of containment also comes through bodily practices, but also in that relationship to secrecy, keeping the ideas and secret concepts away from prying eyes. And that's sort of that form of containment. It's a kind of social form of containment. And then in the Bhakti tradition, what we get containment expressed in terms of these energies that are accelerated in the ecstatic states are focused back inward in a kind of integral form of yoga to relieve the karmic disposition. This was articulated in the philosophies of Chaitanya, one of the chief saints of the tradition that we'll look at more carefully. And then, of course, ecstasy is experienced in the tantric tradition through the sexual yogas. This ecstasy is rechanneled into the body. The bliss states are explored through Kundalini yoga. The ecstasy is expressed outwardly in the Bhakti traditions in group ecstasy, swaying of arms, the movement of energy that comes through a group of people doing similar actions, and the generation of the voice and the opening of the heart that comes through song. And of course, the ecstasy in the Hatha Yoga tradition comes from containing these pranic forces and having them move through the body and awaken the spiritual centers so that prana moves more efficiently and powerfully and brings bliss states to the individual practitioner. So Tantra's big party was kind of shut down by the Muslims. As we know from our modern experience, the Muslim tradition tends to be more orthodox, tend to be more standardized in its practices. It's not so open to creativity or mystic states, though we do see it in exceptional cases. The roles of male and female are set down very strongly. The cycle of the day with its bowings to Mecca are done in a certain orthodox procedure. A lot of rules around how you enter the temple, what you wear, how you cover the body, etc., etc. So the tradition of Islam was very much unlike the Hindu tradition that it encountered, and it did not bode well for the ecstatic creativity of the tantric traditions. The tantric traditions in the Buddhist form were pretty much wiped out because they depended more on institutional structures. And so when the Muslims came and wiped out the monasteries and wiped out the kingdoms, Buddhism, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist in the Indian subcontinent. Muhammad of Ghazni was the first Muslim raider of importance to come down into the northern kingdoms of India and start to destroy the temples. He continued to raid for a number of decades, and then other conquerors followed him, and as a result, the tantric kingdoms declined and fell, and it created a state of mind in India of threat And the way that India coped with this was creative in its own way. And if we look at the modern experience of Gandhi, we can kind of see an echo of it. Rather than turning outward, they turned inward. And this was part of the way that Bhakti arose. And we'll unfold that in a careful way, a few slides down. But the first thing I want to look at in the way that it turned inward was that the tantric traditions created Hatha yoga. So they took away a lot of the extra elements of the tantric practices. They simplified the practices and pared them down to basically what we could do in the body. The gurus who had been supported by the kingdoms, by the court, by the monasteries, were sent out in a diaspora to the different points of India, and they were given to experiment with new forms of working with the body. And this form of portable practice we call Hatha yoga, which mainly involves cleansing practices and attaining certain cities, certain miraculous powers through focusing on the energy in the body, was born circa around 1100. The chief gurus were Matsyendra and Gorakhnath. Matsyendra was a tantric. Gorakhnath is often credited with being a full-blown Hatha yogi and looking to the tradition of the Naths. Tantra took this new underground form through his innovations and the innovations of others, and we get this Hatha yoga tradition, which is the root of our tradition of modern postural yoga. We have pared down this practice even more than the Hatha yogis. We focus almost exclusively on the postures. We have moved them towards athletic forms of practice and dropped away many of the esoteric elements, the subtle body elements. These things are still experienced when we do the postures because they have this technological aspect. They have the capacity to move our energy and clarify our energy. So we're getting it sort of secondhand. It's not so much explicit because the training of our modern gurus is not so deep, and they have a loose relationship to their lineages. We go through these brief secular teacher trainings. We often leave out the devotional elements that can bring in more power. We often leave aside the pranayamic practices or cleansing practices, which can generate more energy, and we don't learn the bandhas, which teach us to contain the energies. But nonetheless, modern postural yoga, in its pared down form, has allowed it to spread throughout the planet, and I'm sure my listeners here are a part of that tradition, and that's partly why I have you as my audience, and I'm grateful for this tradition and what it's done. I'm grateful for you as my listeners. It is creative, it is innovative, it has adapted itself to householder life. Modern postural yoga is a force in the world for good, and it is born out of a more complex tradition, and it's becoming newly complex in its own way, in its embrace of the traditions of Ayurveda, its embrace of the traditions of Chinese medicine, its embrace of the traditions of Western medicine, empirical medicine, allopathy, its embrace of dance and martial arts. So it's becoming newly complex in exterior ways rather than in interior ways. Okay. So one of the interesting relationships that I want to point out and that was advertised as a part of this seminar is the tie to our North American traditions of the Native American Indians, named by Columbus when he thought he was discovering India way back in 1492. The Indian traditions went through a similar experience that the Indian traditions of the West, the Native American traditions, went through a similar experience that the Indians went through in India with the invasion of the Muslims. Of course, the Indians of America were experiencing the invasions of another group of Aryans, the Aryans from Europe, and this created a crisis in their community, a kind of eschatological crisis, an end times crisis, an Armageddon crisis, what we call a millenarian way of responding to reality. It seemed like the collapse of their entire world, and in fact it very much was. And in response to this crisis, and we see this in other traditions. We see this in the tradition of revelation in the Bible, in the same way when the Christian traditions were also threatened by Roman power and were seeing their tradition looking at extinction, is that there comes to be this kind of millenarian thinking, this end times thinking, but at the same time it seems to be ushering in a golden age of triumph. This is partly an impetus behind the Bhakti traditions in India in the wake of the Muslim invasion. And we see it in the Indian traditions of America. It takes on many similar forms. Here it took on the form of the ghost dance, again an ecstatic tradition of chanting and dancing. We see these same kind of dancing traditions in India. And it had this millenarian theology behind it, articulated by this Indian by the name of Jack Wilson, and it suggested that the dead would be raised, they would form an army with the living, they would drive out the white settlers, there would be peace and harmony among the tribes of American Indians, and a new golden age would come in free of the white people. Of course, this did not come to pass, but this was a revelation. Jack Wilson said that he sat at the feet of the gods and they told him that this would happen. So it gave birth to this ecstatic tradition that looked inward, very much like the ecstatic tradition that looked inward in the Indian traditions in the face of extinction from the Muslim conquerors. So post-Muslim invasion, we get this explosion of the Bhakti traditions. We get the explosion of orthodox forms of Advaita Vedanta philosophy right alongside with it. It takes up Advaita and it has its own series of saints, most significantly the Alvars and Natamuni, and I think we'll foreshadow modern Bhakti. But here, let's jump to the Alvars. So this is kind of a percolation of Bhakti, which happens before the full-blown expression of it in the face of the Muslim invasions. That 12 Alvars from the 5th to 9th century were a group of singer-saints that were coming out of Tamil Nadu, and they composed these popular songs in vernacular languages and the languages of Tamil, and they toured around the area of Tamil Nadu, which is in the south east, and to some degree moved up into the north. And they were populist figures, but because they had an oral tradition, their songs were lost, and it took this figure of Natamuni, who was a bit of a scribe and who claimed his own divine revelation, to create a resurgence of the Alvar tradition, of the Bhakti tradition. You can see his lifeline here. He composed a book called the Divya Prabandham, which was a text of 4,000 hymns from the Alvars. At least he claimed they were from the Alvars. He said he channeled them because these hymns had been lost. And these became a part of the liturgical structure of the tradition that he gave birth to, which we call Vaishnavism. You might know that term Vaishnavism because I mentioned it earlier in describing the tradition of Krishnamacharya. Krishnamacharya looked to Natamuni. He had his own personal relationship to Natamuni because he claimed to have channeled a lost text from Natamuni called the Yoga Rahasya. I've written extensively on the Yoga Rahasya. If you'll go to my website, prasannayoga.com, you'll find my long essay on this book. We, as modern scholars, know it is a modern text, but it is an expression of Krishnamacharya, this modern father of modern Hatha Yoga, and his relationship to his tradition and the tradition of Sri Vaishnavism, which was a Bhakti tradition. So Bhakti comes into the modern experience through Krishnamacharya. It comes into the Hindu experience through the scholarly work of Natamuni, the recording of these chants, and as the head of a major temple in Tamil Nadu, he brought them into practice and they spread throughout India. It still did not have a kind of a proper orthodox base. It was still a little bit of a heterodox tradition because it was based in these languages outside Sanskrit. But it took this figure of Ramanuja to change that. He blended the tradition of Natamuni, of Sri Vaishnavism, with the tradition of Advaita Vedanta, from the tradition of Shankaracharya, the great teacher. And he put it on an orthodox footing. He put it on a Sanskrit footing. So Ramanuja is an important figure. He had a very colorful life in which he had a number of gurus and a kind of a troublesome wife who undercut his relationship to his gurus, and the stories are kind of playful and interesting. Eventually he ends up leaving his wife and becoming a devoted practitioner of his art, and an important theologian who also did work to dissolve the relationship of the Varnas. He was a populist. He did not emphasize the caste system, and he sought to bring the masses together in a new and powerful movement, and he pretty much succeeded in his task. What's meaningful about Ramanuja in terms of Bhakti and in terms of the modern tradition, we just looked at Shankaracharya, we'll come back to him in a moment, is that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu broke off from Ramanuja, and as an incarnation of both Krishna and Radha, his female companion, he created an acceleration in the Bhakti tradition that looked to the work of Ramanuja, but broke off from it in its own direction. And so the work of Krishnacharya doesn't look to Chaitanya's work. It's a more pure Bhakti tradition. And we'll come back to this in a moment when we look again at the Hare Krishnas in the modern tradition. And I hope I'm not weaving too many threads for my listeners here. Oops, that's going forward, so we'll go backwards. So Shankaracharya was this important figure. He was a figure mainly outside of the tantric fold, even though, as we see from his dates, that he was active in the period when Tantra was in its heyday. Shankaracharya was important to Ramanuja because he looked to the way in which Shankaracharya anchored the tradition in a singular philosophy of non-dualism. He called his form of it Advaita Vedanta. Vedanta means the end of the Vedas, and by the end of the Vedas, what he means is he looked at texts that came after the Vedic corpus had kind of ended its compositional period in 800 years before the Common Era. So he looks at the Upanishads that we mentioned earlier. He looks at the Bhagavad Gita. He looks at the Brahma Sutras. We call this the Prasthana Trayi, the three legs of this new tradition, or this kind of recalibrated tradition of Advaita Vedanta that came through Shankaracharya. He wrote commentaries on the body of texts that are the Upanishads, the 10 to 13 texts of the Upanishads, and he wrote a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, and he wrote a commentary on the Brahma Sutras, which were themselves a commentary on the Upanishads, and he put them all together into this new philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, which said that the Atman, the inner soul of the individual, is one with the Godhead, one with Brahman, but our idea that it is not is merely an illusion, it's a Maya. And the path of this tradition of Shankaracharya focuses on Jnana Yoga. It focuses on the inward experience of knowing. So it is said that once you realize that the Atman and Brahman were one, then realization came to you. A very similar, simple formula, which based itself on, as I say, vidya, on knowledge. It was a kind of intellectual approach. So in this way, it was very clean, it was very orthodox, it was acceptable to the masses, and that was partly why it spread, and partly why it became the mainline philosophy of the Hindu tradition. And when we look at Vivekananda coming to the West, as we did in the previous lecture, he was a champion of Advaita Vedanta because he knew it would pass muster as a very clean philosophical system. It wouldn't have any of the weird elements of Tantra. It wouldn't have any of the challenging aspects of Bhakti, which would encourage Westerners to worship a saint other than Christ. He gave us this form of Neo-Vedanta, which came into the West as a philosophy that Westerners could appreciate and respect. So Shankaracharya's work has legs. It travels through the tradition in the form of Bhakti after Ramanuja. It travels in the tradition partly in the yogic traditions, as it was taken up by the worshippers of Vishnu, who also took up the Hatha yoga traditions and blended them in householder traditions of yoga after the birth of Hatha yoga in the late Middle Ages. And of course, Krishnamacharya, coming back to him again, he is where all of these nodes came together, because he was a follower of Shankaracharya, and he was someone who practiced Hatha yoga in his householder tradition, and he was someone who looked to Natamuni and Ramanuja in his unique tradition of Bhakti yoga, Sri Vaishnavism. So all of these elements came together in Krishnamacharya. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, there we are, Guru Nanak. Okay, just wanted to see where we were going here. Come to modern Bhakti, and we'll look again a little bit at Bhaktivedanta Prabhupada. So Bhaktivedanta Prabhupada, we already looked at him, came to America in 1966. He saw himself as a reincarnation of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and that was partly how he was able to move with such power in the West and be so effective, is that he definitely was an anointed person. He was a person with great power. So he was channeling these teachings of Mahaprabhu, and his emphasis as a reincarnation of Radha and Krishna was on, I don't know how that dancing couple got in the middle of my slide. Actually, I do, but they shouldn't be there. But they're not completely inconsistent with the story that we're about to tell. So what Chaitanya focused on was the male and female aspect of the Godhead and integrating these into one's personality through the experience of ecstatic chant. One sort of became, we also got that dancer on the right, I'm seeing. So this slide needs to be edited, but as I say, not completely inconsistent, male-female polarity. Chaitanya emphasized the singular worship of Krishna. So here we get monotheism in the form of Krishna, very much like we got in Bhagavad Gita. Chaitanya looks strongly back at the Bhagavad Gita as the source text for his Bhakti tradition, and of course it is the source text for our Bhakti tradition today. We don't have Radha as a figure in Bhagavad Gita, but we do have her in the Purana stories, in the Bhagavata Purana, which is the chief Purana that is looked at by Chaitanya and his bhaktas, especially the 10th book, in which we get these stories of Krishna as a small child and all of his crazy activities of playing around with his gopis, with his many lovers, and destroying demons and doing mischievous acts as a baby. These are a story cycle which give us a kind of devotional basis on which to set the practices of Bhakti Yoga. Chaitanya foregrounded the worship of Krishna and Radha. And here we have this other thread, as you can see from the dates of the life of Guru Nanak, who came from the north of India. He was a contemporary of Chaitanya, and he's important because he was a Sikh. And the Sikhs were a new tradition born out of Hinduism. Both of Guru Nanak's parents were Hindus. They were members of the Vaishya, the merchant class. They gave birth to Sikhism, and of course Sikhism gave birth to Yogi Bhajan, who brought his form of Kundalini Yoga to the West in 1968. What is interesting to note about Guru Nanak is that he was anti-yoga, and he was anti-esotericism. He worked against the residual elements of Tantra and definitely worked against the sannyasi practices. He was firmly in the role of householder, and he promoted a lifestyle that was wholesome and based on family and based on work and based on self-possession and agreement with society. So a very mainline orthodox tradition, but important to our story, not only because it feeds into the Sikhism, the kind of neo-Sikhism, the new form of Sikhism that Yogi Bhajan brought to America, but also because it emphasized chant. He wrote he composed his own text of over 900 chants, and this became a central part of his Orthodox tradition. And again, we're seeing this kind of mirroring that we see in many of these mainline traditions. It is safe to explore the ecstasy that comes through heart-focused bhakti. That is a form of orthodoxy which works, and it integrates some of these elements of secrecy, secret relationship, impersonal relationship to the divine, containment of the energy that is brought about through these ecstatic practices, and then of course ecstasy in the form of group practice. We see these forms in the Sikhism of Guru Nanak, though the overall thrust of it, as I say, is orthodox and not esoteric. So this walks us into modern bhakti. Modern bhakti, as we can see from the singular slide, has its roots in some powerful performers who look to Neem Karoli Baba there in the top, a saint from India who was born in 1900 and died in 1973. He was a pure bhakta who looked to the worship of Hanuman. Baba Hari Das, the figure to Neem Karoli Baba's right, came to America in 1973. He was not a follower of Neem Karoli Baba, but he also taught Bhakti Yogi, and he ran the ashram of Neem Karoli Baba. To the right there, we have Krishna Das. Below him, Bhagavan Das. In the middle, Jai Uttal. Over on the left, below below on the second register, we have Ram Das, and then David Newman, and then my little video that I promised from Woodstock. So Bhagavan Das, Jai Uttal, and Krishna Das were all followers of Neem Karoli Baba, and they are part of the primary thrust behind the modern bhakti movement. They have blended their devotional fervor for their guru with modern systems of music. Krishna Das, of course, won a Grammy in 2013, and Jai Uttal has also been Grammy nominated, though he hasn't won anything. Ram Das wrote "Be Here Now" in 1970 and worked to bring the great teacher Baba Muktananda to America in 1973. So these figures, and Bhagavan Das, of course, has released his own chants and books as well. These figures, all branching out from Neem Karoli Baba, have been key in accelerating modern bhakti. Modern bhakti through its festival system that we saw in the last lecture, and also through its birthplace at Woodstock. And we'll take a look at the teaching of Tom Law here at Woodstock in a moment, and kind of pull in this last thread of David Newman, who actually was not in the presence of Neem Karoli Baba, but outside of a personal, physical relationship to Neem Karoli Baba. He channeled a devotional relationship to him and has also become an important figure on the Bhakti circuit, having released 15 discs on his own. But let's go a little bit back in time before the modern Bhakti period to this node of August 1969, when the Woodstock Festival was initiated. And here we're going to see, it really is delightful, we're going to see the teaching of yoga from the main stage at Woodstock, and the kind of innocent way in which Tom Law speaks about it. Tom Law came from the hog farm, which was this commune in California, which was hired to be the police force, P-L-E-A-S-E, the security force for Woodstock, headed up by Wavy Gravy, who you might know. So these figures from this commune taught some Kundalini yoga. So here we go.
Now very slowly start coming back up. Lower the lock and pull yourself back up. And then keep breathing as fast as you can. Exhale. And relax. And just feel the energy. These are all beginning exercises of Kundalini Yoga.
Sound is not perfect.
It's the same energy that drugs give you, force a rush on with, right? It's the same channels, only drugs do it for you, and this way you can do it yourself. You can do it when you want to, and you don't have to score to be able to do it. All you got to score is some clean air. And we even did, I learned it in Los Angeles, and there was only a couple months of clean air when I was learning it, so.
Little translation there for Spanish
That's
speakers.
hard too these days. But while there's still some clean air left, it'd be groovy to experiment with it, like these guys who have been experimenting for at least 6,000 years and getting very high behind it. The Kundalini nerve, it's called the nerve of awareness. You can't dissect it. It's a current that runs up the center of your spine. I don't know if any of you have ever sat down and crossed your legs and smoked DMT and watched what happens, but what happens to me is this big thing
little
goes
video of
up
Tai
my
Chi
spine
practitioners,
and flashes in my
a little
brain,
bit out
right?
of sync.
Well, apparently that's what is going to happen if I do this stuff and learn it. It takes years, I guess, but this is the beginning of it. These exercises are exercises to create those channels in your body and to free your body of blocks. Major block is your solar plexus. That's why we're doing a lot of breath of fire. It loosens the solar plexus. Then
Here
they're
you see
blocking
the
your spine,
familiar
your
breathing
back, and wherever
practices
you
of
got
Kundalini
blocks to keep that energy from flowing. Go within yourself, meditate on each breath. Make each breath a complete breath. And if you do it right, you'll be flashing momentarily. Keep up, concentrate on your breathing, and hold that position. Roll your toes forward so they're pointing forward.
Birthplace of modern Bhakti. So some elements of modern Bhakti: the relief of Varna, as we looked at, the dissolution of the caste system. The Sampradaya is the school of focus, in this case Advaita Vedanta. The focus on the Deva, of course, the Godhead, the Deva, or the Devi, the god or the goddess. The use of mantra in a public forum. The coming together of this practice of mantra in kirtan. And then, of course, as we saw on the previous slide, if one has a relationship to a guru, it's all that much more powerful, as these significant figures did to Neem Karoli Baba. Okay. We're coming to the close of our lecture, and I just want to touch again on this aspect of the inclusion of opposites. And this is the kind of the beautiful theology or philosophy behind Bhakti. It seeks to dissolve all difference, and it is a model for us as individuals in a polyglot society, in a egalitarian society, which, as we can see in the modern day, is so riven by factionalism. Not so much, I mean, we emphasize, of course, we foreground this struggle with race, and it's very clear that there are terrible things happening in race relations. One thing that I want to foreground that we don't always so much foreground is how we are so divided along political lines, and this is threatening America especially, but we also see this in other movements, in the movement of Brexit and the anger at immigrants and the hardline leader that was recently elected in the Philippines. So Bhakti is a source for us. It's a tool for us to experience this dissolution of opposites, to embrace the other, to look at our prejudices, to take our prejudices both against others and the parts of ourselves that we are uncomfortable with. When we work on our mat to have a devotional disposition, was said by Krishnamacharya to be the only thing that made Hatha Yoga effective, the only thing that moved us towards moksha or liberation. I don't completely agree with him. I think that the asanas in and of themselves have a way of transforming us. But if we add bhakti to the mix, if we take this cue from this long and storied tradition, which we have just recently walked through its history, and bring that to our inner disposition, a kind of esoteric devotion to what is ultimate, and keep in mind whatever our vision of ultimacy is, be it just consciousness, or be it some moral framework, or be it some activist framework, or be it actually some idea of the God. These things are good, and they empower our merely mundane practice of physical postures. Of course, if you have the opportunity to go to a Khatan, I highly encourage it. That is this Bhakti coming into the West, and it can be found almost everywhere on small stages and great stages. We end our story there. Gaboom! I hope that this seminar has been of value to you, that it has met your expectations. Feel free to write me at prasannayoga@gmail.com if you have further questions. I hope to see you in further seminars or on the road. I'm not sure when you're listening to this, but it is now August of 2016, and I'm heading to America for 3 months, and perhaps I will see some of my listeners there. Blessings to you all. Thank you for listening. Be in the Bhav. Rest well. Blessings. Eric Shaw signing off.